In 1590, the Spanish crown controlled more gold and silver than every other nation on earth combined. A fortune that flowed in endless galleons from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas. 80 years later, that same empire was bankrupt 4 times over. Reduced to a secondary power on the European stage, its global dominance, a fading memory. In 1914, Britain governed 1/4 of the world's land and population. Its pound sterling, the undisputed anchor of international trade, accepted from Shanghai to Santiago. By 1970, the empire had dissolved. The sun finally set, and the once mighty currency had become little more than a regional instrument. The Soviet Union, at its peak in the mid-1980 seconds, deployed over 30,000 nuclear warheads, maintained iron control over half of Europe, and stood as America's equal in the bipolar world. 900 days after Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms began to unravel, the red flag came down over the Kremlin, and the superpower simply ceased to exist. 3 empires, 3 centuries apart, 3 complete collapses. What ties them together is not invasion or battlefield defeat, but a precise 7-stage sequence rooted in economics, overreach, and the erosion of trust. The pattern is not random, it is structural, driven by the same imbalances that arise whenever a dominant power stretches beyond its sustainable limits. And here is the sobering reality. For 2025, the United States has already satisfied the diagnostic criteria for the first 5 stages. Military commitments span the globe at levels no prior empire attempted. The dollar, though still dominant, has been expanded far beyond historical precedents. Debt now compounds faster than growth can service it. Productive capacity has migrated offshore. Social cohesion is fracturing under measurable strain. This is not a forecast of inevitable doom, but a measured assessment of position on a well-documented timeline. In the sections ahead, we will examine each historical case in sequence: Spain, from 1,500 to 1,700, Britain from 1,900 to 1,970, the Soviet Union from 1,945 to 1,991, identifying the exact mechanisms at each stage. We will then place the United States on the same grid, using current data to confirm the alignment. Finally, we will outline the 2 remaining stages and the narrow window that still exists for course correction. The goal is clarity, not alarm. Understanding the pattern is the first step toward navigating it. Imperial collapse rarely announces itself with fanfare or foreign armies at the borders. It begins in the quiet erosion of balance sheets, long before the headlines register the shift. Empires fall not from a single decisive blow, but because the internal arithmetic ceases to add up. Military obligations grow faster than the revenue base can support them. The currency that once commanded universal acceptance begins to require explanation, then coercion. Productive capacity migrates or atrophies, and the most capable citizens redirect their energies elsewhere, often abroad. These are not moral failings. They are structural inevitabilities when expansion outpaces the underlying economy. The early phase is deceptively stable. Markets function. Trade flows. A carrier battle group can still project power halfway around the world. And the national currency remains the default choice for international contracts. Yet beneath this surface, the foundations are already compromising. Interest payments compound on prior borrowing. Factories that once supplied domestic needs now stand idle or repurposed for lower value activities. Allies, sensing the strain, to begin to diversify their options, opening parallel accounts in alternative currencies, negotiating bilateral deals that bypass the hegemon's financial plumbing. These moves are not dramatic. They are pragmatic hedges against a future that is becoming statistically probable. The transition to acceleration occurs when the empire's signature advantages invert into liabilities. A reserve currency held in vast quantities abroad becomes a potential flood of repatriated capital, driving domestic inflation and forcing interest rates higher. A network of global bases, once a symbol of unassailable reach, transforms into a constellation of fixed costs that must be funded even as tax receipts flatten. Credibility, which for decades required no justification, now demands constant reaffirmation through concessions, side payments, or demonstrations of resolve that strain the budget further. At this point, the system is no longer self-reinforcing, it is self-consuming. What makes the process predictable is its recurrence across disparate contexts. Over the past 5 centuries, 3 superpowers, each at the zenith of global influence, followed the identical 7-stage trajectory. The mechanisms differ in detail but converge in logic over extension. Debasement, debt, deindustrialization, decay, de-dollarization, and dissolution. The sequence is not ideological, it is thermodynamic. Energy invested in maintenance exceeds energy extracted from the system, and entropy accelerates. Spain in the 16th century controlled the planetary supply of precious metals, yet succumbed to the same forces. Britain, master of a quarter of the world's surface, in 1914, watched its sterling zone unravel within 2 generations. The Soviet Union, possessor of the largest nuclear arsenal in history, disintegrated without firing a shot in anger. Each believed its unique attributes, geography, institutions, or ideology would insulate it from the pattern. Each discovered that economic laws operate independently of exceptionalist narratives. In the sections that follow, we will dissect these 3 case studies, stage by stage, identifying the precise thresholds where quantitative strain became qualitative rupture. We will then apply the same diagnostic framework to the United States in 2025, using verifiable metrics to determine our exact position on the timeline. The purpose is not to predict a date, but to illuminate the remaining degrees of freedom, the policy adjustments that can still arrest the sequence before the final inversion becomes irreversible. The first empire we examine is Spain, the original global hegemon that discovered infinite wealth and learned, at ruinous cost, that money alone cannot sustain an empire. The Spanish Empire offers the clearest original blueprint for imperial collapse, a cautionary tale of a nation that stumbled upon what seemed like limitless wealth and proceeded to spend itself into irrelevance. By 1580, the crown was extracting approximately 400 tons of silver each year from the mines of the New World, representing roughly 80% of the planet's annual production. Gold inflows, though smaller in volume, added further luster. This bounty transformed the Spanish real into the first genuinely global currency, minted in consistent weights and fineness, and accepted without question in ports from Manila to Antwerp. Merchants in Asia preferred it to local coin. European bankers used it as the standard for letters of credit. For a brief moment, Spain did not merely participate in the world economy, it defined its monetary grammar, yet the seeds of dissolution were sown in the very mechanisms that sustained this dominance. Stage 1 unfolded as military overextension. Philip II, ascending the throne in 1556, inherited commitments that spanned 4 continents. In the Mediterranean, Spanish tercios battled Ottoman galleys from Lepanto to Tunis. In Northern Europe, 80,000 troops suppressed the Dutch revolt, a grinding insurgency that drained treasuries for decades. Across the Atlantic, garrisons secured the silver routes against English privateers and indigenous uprisings. In Asia, forts in the Philippines guarded the Manila galleon trade. Defense and interest payments together absorbed 60% of ordinary revenue before any extraordinary levies, creating a structural deficit that no single campaign could resolve. The response was Stage 2 currency debasement. The flood of American silver triggered persistent inflation. Prices in Castile quadrupled between 1,500 and 1,600 mainit. Rather than curb expenditure, the crown diluted the coinage. A piece stamped as 8 reals, originally 93% fine silver, dropped to 50% by the 1,620 seconds and 25% by the 1,640 seconds. Merchants, sensing the erosion, demanded payment in higher quality Dutch guilders or Genoese bills of exchange. The real's universal acceptance fractured, and with it the crown's ability to settle obligations at face value. Stage 3 arrived as a debt spiral. To bridge the gap, Philip borrowed from Genoese and Augsburg, banking houses at rates that escalated to 40% during crises. The crown suspended payments in 1557, barely a year into the reign. Then again, in 1575, 1596, and 1,607 sovereign defaults within the lifetime of a single generation. Each restructuring involved forced conversions of short-term, high-interest loans into long-term like Staters, lower-yield bonds known as Juros, buying temporary liquidity at the cost of compounding future claims. The interest burden grew faster than the silver fleets could replenish the treasury. With monetary discipline abandoned, Stage 4 manifested as loss of productive capacity. Treasure inflows convinced the nobility that commerce was beneath their station. Arable land shifted from wheat to merino sheep for wool exports. Domestic grain production stagnated. Shipyards in Bilbao and Seville closed as the crown purchased vessels abroad. By mid-century, Spain imported Baltic grain, Flemish textiles, and even cannon from England and the Netherlands. The empire became a conduit. Precious metals entered Seville and exited almost immediately to pay for foreign goods and foreign creditors. When mine output peaked in the 1,590 seconds and began its inevitable decline, the entire edifice trembled. Stage 5. Social decay followed inexorably. Heavy taxation crushed the Castilian peasantry. Arbitrary levies and forced labor sparked localized revolts. Artisans and merchants emigrated to Amsterdam and Antwerp. Taking capital and expertise with them, Madrid's population plateaued, while banditry proliferated along the roads. The bureaucracy and military remained, but the creative core of the economy hollowed out. The outcome was territorial fragmentation, masked by cartographic continuity. Portugal broke away in 1640, after 60 years of union. The Dutch Republic secured formal independence in 1648. After 80 years of war, Spain retained vast colonies on paper, but the economic engine that had financed global power was gone. From the world's preeminent hegemon in 1580, it descended to a mid-tier European state by 1700, a decline compressed into little more than a century. Spain's trajectory is not an outlier. It is the archetype. The same forces operated in Britain 3 centuries later, under different technologies and ideologies, yet with identical structural logic. We turn now to the empire on which the sun never set, and the sequence that finally caused it to do so. The British Empire in the early 20th century represented the most extensive political entity in human history. A system that won 2 global conflicts, yet emerged from victory, economically crippled, and ultimately dismantled. In 1914, it encompassed 412 million subjects across 13.7 million square miles. Roughly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface and population. The pound sterling served as the linchpin of international finance, settling 60% of world trade invoices and backed by gold reserves that constituted 1/3 of the global total. Concentrated in the vaults beneath the Bank of England in London, Stage 1 commenced with military overextension on a scale that dwarfed even Spain's ambitions. British garrisons were stationed on 6 continents, from Singapore to Sierra Leone, supported by a Royal Navy that adhered to the 2-power standard, a fleet larger than the next 2 naval powers combined. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 transformed latent commitments into immediate catastrophe. The conflict consumed £7 billion, equivalent to 140% of Britain's 1,913 gross domestic product. With domestic savings insufficient, the Treasury liquidated foreign assets and borrowed heavily from the United States, marking the first time a rising power extended credit to a declining one on such terms. The war's monetary toll initiated Stage 2 currency debasement. Britain's gold reserves halved between 1,914 and 918, as bullion shipments paid for American munitions and foodstuffs. In 1925, Chancellor Winston Churchill restored the gold standard at the pre-war parity of $4.86 per pound, a decision that overvalued the currency by 10 to 15% relative to wholesale prices. British coal, textiles, and steel became uncompetitive on world markets. Export volumes contracted sharply, and unemployment in industrial regions doubled within 5 years. The policy defended the pound's prestige at the expense of the real economy. A classic inversion of financial symbolism over productive substance. Stage 3. Unfolded as a debt spiral that neither victory nor austerity could arrest. By 1918, Britain owed the United States $4.7 billion, a sum that required annual interest payments, exceeding new borrowing capacity in peacetime. World War II compounded the burden with an additional $30 billion in lend-lease obligations and further asset sales. By 1945, net external liabilities surpassed annual economic output, rendering the empire fiscally dependent on its former colony across the Atlantic. The 1,946 Anglo-American loan, secured at 2% interest with stringent repayment clauses, underscored the reversal. The creditor had become the debtor. With fiscal space exhausted, Stage 4 materialized as loss of empire. The Indian subcontinent, which had subsidized the sterling area through forced exports and reserve pooling, achieved independence in 1947. The departure of the Raj eliminated a critical fiscal prop. Within 18 years, 47 additional territories followed, from Malaya to Kenya. As colonies repatriated sterling balances and diversified into dollars or local currencies, the Bank of England's reserve pool drained at an accelerating rate. The Suez Crisis of 1956, where American financial pressure forced British withdrawal, symbolized the new reality imperial reach now required Washington's permission. Stage 5 completed the cycle with currency collapse. The pound, fixed at $4.03 1,939 for wartime stability, suffered serial devaluations to $2.80 1,949. Armeyuan, 40 inches 1,967, and floating downward thereafter. Adjusted for inflation, its purchasing power has fallen to approximately $1.27. Today's terms, sterling's share of global foreign exchange reserves, 55% in 1950, now hovers below 5%. The City of London remains a financial hub, but on the strength of deregulated capital flows rather than imperial tribute, the outcome is a nation that retains a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, nuclear capabilities, and considerable cultural influence, yet operates within an economic frame that is unmistakably post-imperial. The trappings of great power status endure, but the material base that once sustained them has become a historical exhibit. Britain's trajectory confirms the pattern's universality. Technology, parliamentary institutions, and liberal ideology offered no exemption from the seven-stage logic. The same forces would confront the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century, under a command economy and Marxist-Leninist doctrine, producing an even more compressed collapse. We examine that case next. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II as the only power capable of matching the United States across every dimension of global influence, a colossus that built an arsenal to rival America's and projected ideology into every continent. Yet it dissolved from internal economic failure in less than 3 years. By 1970, the USSR maintained approximately 40,000 nuclear warheads, enforced political control over 14 satellite states in Eastern Europe, and had placed the first human in orbit, demonstrating technological parity in the most visible arenas of the Cold War. Its military-industrial complex employed millions and consumed resources on a scale that dwarfed the Manhattan Project, all coordinated through a centralized planning apparatus that promised to surpass capitalism within decades. Stage 1 manifested as military overextension. Though expressed through subsidy rather than direct taxation, official defense spending absorbed 15 to 20% of gross domestic product, 3 times the comparable U.S. burden when adjusted for economic size. Beyond the homeland, the Warsaw Pact required constant material support tanks for Poland, aircraft for East Germany, advisors for Vietnam. Proxy clients farther afield demanded even more. Cuba received an annual subsidy equivalent to 7% of its own economy. Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, and Nicaragua together drained billions in hard currency that the Soviet system could scarcely afford. These commitments were not optional. They were the price of ideological credibility in a bipolar world. The structural weakness revealed itself in Stage 2 economic stagnation. Central planning prioritized heavy industry and quantitative targets, steel tonnage, tractor counts, while neglecting consumer goods and innovation. Official growth rates, already questionable, decelerated from 6% annually in the 1950 seconds to near zero by the late 1970 seconds, turning negative in the 1980 seconds outside the energy sector. The Soviet Union possessed the planet's largest expanse of arable land, yet agricultural inefficiency forced imports of 40 million tons of grain each year by the mid-1980 seconds, purchased with scarce foreign exchange. Factories produced machinery that broke down quickly. Research institutes duplicated Western designs years after commercial release. The system generated volume, but not value, and the gap widened inexorably. Stage 3 arrived with currency collapse. Though the ruble never functioned as a true international unit, it was non-convertible, confined to domestic accounting and bilateral clearing agreements with client states. On the black market, a single U.S. dollar fetched 30 rubles or more against an official rate of less than 1. Oil and gas exports provided the only reliable hard currency inflow, masking deeper insolvency until the 1986 price crash cut revenues by half in 12 months. Gold reserves, secretly drawn down to finance grain purchases, fell below levels needed to sustain even minimal imports. The Soviet economy became a barter operation dressed in Marxist rhetoric, with no fiscal cushion. Stage 4 unfolded as loss of empire. The turning point came in 1989, when Poland legalized solidarity, Hungary opened its border with Austria, and Czechoslovakia tolerated mass demonstrations. These events cascaded within months. The Warsaw Pact unraveled not through invasion, but through withdrawal of Soviet willingness to intervene. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, 1989. East Germany held free elections in March 1990 and voted for reunification by October. The satellite system that had provided strategic depth and ideological validation vanished in under a year, leaving the USSR geographically and psychologically exposed. Stage 5 completed the sequence with total collapse. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. No foreign army crossed the border. No internal coup succeeded in restoring order. The central bank could not pay salaries. Factories could not secure inputs. And republics declared independence in rapid succession. Gross domestic product contracted by 40% in the final 3 years without external shock. The outcome was fragmentation into 15 successor states. Russia inherited the nuclear arsenal, the Security Council seat, and permanent membership in international bodies. But only half the economic output of the former Union. The command economy's collapse demonstrated that ideological cohesion cannot substitute for productive efficiency when resource allocation is divorced from market signals. The Soviet case compresses the 7-stage pattern into 4 decades, accelerated by the absence of a convertible currency and the rigidity of central planning. Yet the underlying dynamics overcommitment, value erosion, fiscal exhaustion, territorial retraction, and systemic failure mirror. Spain and Britain, precisely. We now apply the same framework to the United States in 2025, where 5 stages are already satisfied by measurable indicators. The data will determine how much time remains before the pattern asserts its full logic. The evidence from 3 prior empires leaves no ambiguity. The 7-stage pattern operates with the precision of a physical law. In 2025, the United States meets every quantitative and qualitative threshold for the first 5 stages. The data are public, verifiable, and accelerating. The timeline does not negotiate exceptions. Stage 1 is military overextension, now institutionalized at unprecedented scale. The Department of Defense maintains approximately 750 installations across 80 countries, with forward-deployed personnel in 150 nations. Fiscal year 2024 authorized $886 billion in defense outlays, more than the combined budgets of the next 9 largest militaries. Yet the Navy operates 50 ships below its own 2030 target. Recruitment shortfalls persist across services, and maintenance backlogs exceed $100 billion. Commitments to NATO, Taiwan, the Persian Gulf, and the Korean Peninsula require simultaneous readiness for high-intensity conflict in 3 theaters. A posture no prior empire sustained without fiscal collapse. Stage 2. Traces to currency debasement. Initiated formally in 1971, when President Nixon suspended dollar-gold convertibility, the M2 money supply stood at $4 trillion in 2000. It exceeds $21 trillion today. Between March 2020 and March 2022 alone, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by $7 trillion in direct stimulus and asset purchases. The cumulative effect is stark. $1 in 1971 purchases 16 cents worth of goods in 2025 terms. The mechanism has shifted from clipping coins to digital expansion, but the outcome erosion of purchasing power and savers' confidence remains identical. Stage 3 manifests as a debt spiral that now compounds faster than economic growth can service. Gross federal debt reached $35, $8 trillion by mid-2025, equivalent to 127% of annual output. Net interest payments approach $1.05 trillion annually, surpassing the entire defense budget and consuming 1/5 of federal revenue. The 2024 deficit registered $1.08 trillion during a period of expansion, with the Treasury scheduled to refinance $8 trillion in maturing obligations over the next 12 months at prevailing market rates. Each percentage point rise in yields adds roughly $350 billion to annual interest within 2 years. A feedback loop that Spain experienced through Genoese lenders and Britain through American bondholders. Stage 4 is loss of productive capacity, measured in both share and strategic vulnerability. Manufacturing contributed 28% of gross domestic product in 1960. The figure is 11% today. The goods trade deficit runs $1 trillion annually, financed by foreign capital inflows that purchase Treasury securities. Critical dependencies are acute. 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients originate abroad. 97% of rare earth processing occurs in China. And 40% of defense-grade semiconductors rely on Taiwanese foundries. The supply chain disruptions of 2021-2022 demonstrated that just-in-time globalization functions until it does not. Stockpiles remain below 90-day requirements for multiple categories. Stage 5. Social decay registers across every leading indicator of cohesion. Gallup polls record the lowest confidence levels on record for Congress, the media, and the federal court system. Opioid-related fatalities exceed 110,000 annually, equivalent to a medium-sized city erased each year. The total fertility rate stands at 1.62 births per woman, well below replacement, and the lowest in recorded history. Prime-age male labor force participation has fallen from 88% in 1960 to 68% today. representing millions of working-age adults disconnected from productive employment. These metrics are not moral judgments. They are diagnostic signals of a society under sustained internal stress. 5 stages are complete. The thresholds crossed by Spain after decades of silver inflows, by Britain after 2 world wars, and by the Soviet Union. After 4 decades of central planning have been satisfied by the United States in a compressed time frame. The pattern does not require ideological alignment or technological parity. It requires only the imbalance between commitments and capacity. What remains are the final 2 stages, already visible in embryonic form. Stage 6 involves the erosion of reserve currency privilege, and Stage 7 is the rapid, nonlinear failure that follows. We examine the early indicators and the narrow policy window that still exists before irreversibility sets in. With 5 stages firmly in place, the United States stands at the threshold of the pattern's terminal phase. Stage 6 is not a distant speculation. It is a negotiation already underway in central bank vaults, trade corridors, and digital payment systems worldwide. The erosion of reserve currency status begins incrementally but accelerates non-linearly once critical mass is reached. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from 69% in 2000 to 58% in 2024. According to International Monetary Fund data, this shift is not random. It reflects deliberate diversification. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa tested a cross-border settlement platform in early 2025, enabling direct renminbi-ruble swaps without dollar intermediation. 22% of Russia-China bilateral trade now clears in renminbi, up from negligible levels a decade ago. Saudi Arabia, long the anchor of petrodollar recycling, accepted yuan for 15% of its oil exports to China in 2024. With pilot programs expanding to India and Brazil, central banks collectively purchased 200 tons of gold in 2024, the highest annual total since 1967, reducing dollar exposure in favor of a non-depreciating asset. These moves are pragmatic, not ideological. Foreign institutions hold approximately $8 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. A mere 10% reduction in willingness to roll over maturing paper would repatriate $800 billion annually. But the mathematics compound a broader 10% divestment across all dollar assets equates to $5 trillion, returning home, injecting the equivalent of 9% of gross domestic product in instantaneous inflationary pressure. Domestic bond yields would spike to attract replacement buyers, pushing interest costs beyond current projections and compressing the fiscal space needed for defense, entitlements, and infrastructure. Stage 7 follows as sudden collapse, not gradual decline. Historical precedent is unambiguous. The Soviet gross domestic product contracted 40% in 3 years, following the 1,989 loss of empire, without a single foreign boot on Russian soil. The trigger sequence is mechanical. A currency shock, perhaps a failed treasury auction or a coordinated BRICS announcement, elevates borrowing costs overnight. Yields on 10-year notes rise from 4% to 8% or higher, adding $700 billion to annual interest within 18 months. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice: monetize the shortfall and risk hyperinflation, or enforce austerity that slashes discretionary spending by 30% or more. Political fracture ensues as states, municipalities, and entitlement programs compete for shrinking federal transfers. The duration from first unpayable rollover to systemic failure typically spans 18 to 36 months. Spain required decades because silver inflows provided intermittent relief. Britain stretched the process across 2 wars. The Soviet Union compressed it into 900 days due to non-convertible currency. The United States, with deeper integration into global finance, faces amplified velocity. A 10% reserve shift today equals a Soviet-scale GDP shock tomorrow. The mathematics are unforgiving. Debt compounds at rates exceeding growth. Trust, once eroded, does not reconstitute without sacrifice. Complexity: 800 overseas bases, $36 trillion in liabilities. Supply chains, spanning continents, amplifies every shock. Stage 6 is the point where external actors vote with their balance sheets. Stage 7 is the internal reckoning, when those votes can no longer be ignored. Yet the pattern is not destiny. Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union each reached Stage 5, convinced reversal was impossible. The United States retains agency if it chooses to exercise it before Stage 6 locks in. The conclusion outlines the 3 concurrent corrections required, and why understanding the sequence is the prerequisite for any meaningful response. Spain trusted its oceans of silver, Britain its parliamentary traditions and naval mastery, the Soviet Union its planned economy and nuclear shield. Each convinced itself that unique advantages rendered basic arithmetic optional. Geography, ideology, technology. None provided exemption. All 3 learned the lesson through dissolution. The United States is not immune. It is merely late in the sequence. Stage 5 represents not the conclusion, but the final juncture where deliberate reversal remains within reach. The window is narrow, measured in years rather than decades. Yet it exists. Correction demands 3 concurrent actions, none optional. First, fiscal balance must be restored within a decade, entailing spending reductions and revenue increases that will test political will to its limit, but without which, interest payments alone will crowd out every other priority. Second, critical supply chains for pharmaceuticals, rare earths, semiconductors, and defense components require reshoring at scale capital-intensive undertakings that demand public-private coordination and acceptance of higher short-term costs for long-term security. Third, institutional legitimacy must be rebuilt through transparent processes, accountable leadership, and shared sacrifice, a generational project that begins with acknowledging the pattern rather than denying it. History evaluates outcomes, not intentions. Empires that recognized the sequence too late paid the full price. Those that never recognized it paid sooner. Understanding the 7 stages is the prerequisite for any effective response. It transforms a seemingly inevitable trajectory into a set of solvable imbalances. If this analysis has clarified the stakes and the remaining choices, like the video, share it with one person who still insists it can't happen here, and subscribe for the follow-up. The next upload examines the specific policy off-ramps fiscal, industrial, and institutional that no prior empire identified in time. See you there.